Hi, everyone. Welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. Always delighted to be talking about youth literature, young adult literature, writing for middle grades, upper elementary, and all through the creating for young people. And I am delighted on this episode to be talking with a person who engages in that kind of work, and that is Dayna Lorentz. Dayna, thank you for joining.
Thank you so much for inviting me to come on and talk
Absolutely.
about my book, Wayward Creatures.
We are twinning with the books here. Absolutely.
I love that.
Uh, yes, yes. And thank you for sharing a copy with me. I always appreciate it. And I will, of course, make sure that it goes to a teacher. I don't sell them or anything. If authors share books with me, I always make sure that they show up in a classroom somewhere. You have other books that have been written, that you've written as well. A trilogy of 3 books, No Safety in Numbers. Did I write that down correctly? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. My scribble is getting scribbly at the end of the day. Of a Feather being another one of your books. And the series, it's also a series, Dogs of the Drowned City as well.
So that's 3 books with, well, groups of books that have animals sort of
I was
as a
gonna
focal
say.
point of the story. And then
Mm-hmm.
my YA series, No Safety in Numbers, is a little more drama, action, adventure, sort of dystopian
Love
mall
it. Mm-hmm.
adventure, which is
Mm-hmm.
really fun.
I think that malls should absolutely be dystopian in literature. I love that. And I love dystopian literature. I was going to ask about that connection to animals and nature because I noticed that. I'm an English teacher. I was like, oh, there's a theme here.
Oh,
So, yes, that's right.
I
So,
see the animals.
that's right. So curious about that.
Well, I love animals and I love nature. I My inspiration for writing the Dogs of the Drowned City books was really I love writing sort of from an animal point of view.
Hmm.
And I sort of pitched some ideas to an editor friend of mine. And, one of these ideas was about dogs. And now I grew up with dogs. I actually have a little page on my website, which is My Life in Dogs, with sort of pictures of all the dogs I've had.
Love it.
And
Love it.
one of the things my family and I did, and I don't know if you do this with your dogs, you mentioned your dogs there.
Hmm.
But we would sort of talk to the dogs as if they were sort of part of the family. Like we would be having a
Absolutely.
dinner conversation, be like, "Hey, what do you think, Benny Box?"
Hmm. Hmm.
And he would also get to voice his complaints. One of us would speak for the dog, but
Yes.
um, that sort of rolled itself naturally for me then into writing, a whole book from a book series from a dog's point of view about dogs living in sort of a dog world. And that sort of has led then to me wanting to write in other animal points of view. And I think it's so much fun because I think, first of all, it's something that's really engaging to readers. Readers, I think, really get involved, love animals. They love talking about their pets and talking about thinking about the world from their pet's point of view. That's kind of an exciting thing. I think it's also exciting to write from an animal's point of view because it allows me to sort of experience the world differently. I do a lot of research into sort of how each of these animals experience the world differently from a human narrator and
Hmm.
try to incorporate elements of that into the way I write the character, not only who the character is and how they sort of live their life, but also how they talk about the world. And, I had a lot of fun writing Of a Feather from an owl's point of view because I was like, well, what would an owl think about these things? Like
Yeah.
how would
Yeah.
they think about hands? They have feet and they use their feet in a way that we would use hands in some ways, but this human hand experience. Also, owls can't move their eyes. So I have my owl really obsessed with his like human friends' eyes, like and what they do and how they work.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah, very cool. With with Wayward Creatures, where does that kind of take you? What do you get to explore that way, incorporating animals and the things that you love?
Well, I thought that, so we have a coyote friend for my main character, Gabe, and her name is Rill. And so I did a lot of research just to even pick the animal who was going to be in this book. I knew I wanted to write another dual point of view book because I think it's really fun to
Hmm.
sort of pair these two stories of an animal and a human character and how they sort of by writing from the animal point of view, I can sort of talk about some of the deeper and maybe harder themes to talk about for a human character in a way that's a little more accessible and even more direct for a reader. So, Gabe is feeling really isolated and alone from all of his family, from his friends, from his community. and Rill too, but Rill because she's sort of a yearling coyote. And she's being asked to take care of this new crop of pups that her parents have had. And she feels like, they don't listen to her. She's got other things she wants to be doing. So, it allows me to talk about this idea of separating from your family,
Hmm.
and trying to go out on your own in a way that's a little bit safer, I think, for kids to think about than it would be for, my character here, who's a human, to think about him and what it means for him to be separating from his family and his friends and that kind of thing. So that's one cool thing about writing from an animal point of view. And in researching this book, I knew that my character Gabe was going to be in sort of this rough position and that he was feeling pretty bad. He's kind of an angry kid. He feels like everyone's wrong, everyone's, doing him wrong, and he, is kind of lashing out. And I wanted to have a character that an animal character who kids could relate to, but who was also one of these kind of outcasts, an outsider. And so I did some research into what is the least loved animal in American society. And
Hmm.
apparently, according to a poll done in the 1970s, more hated than even cockroaches or rats is the coyote.
Ah,
And I was like,
interesting.
wow, that's so cool to learn. And I think,
Uh-huh.
the other cool thing, this book is set in a sort of fake version of my hometown. I live in the Burlington area in Vermont. And so I
Mhm.
made this East Burlington. And the we have coyotes living in my neighborhood. So it sort of worked. I found this animal that was an outsider who also, they live all over America. You can find coyotes in Central Park. You can find coyotes in Florida. You can. I was
Wow.
actually visiting with a school this morning, and they were like, "We have coyotes,"
Nice, nice.
and we have coyotes up here in South Burlington. The coyotes, the thing that unites all of our communities in America.
There it is. There it is. Yeah.
So that's how I brought my animal point of view in, and Real really does give this different way of talking about some of the themes that I bring up in this book. Sort of like, what does it mean to be responsible for something happening? Like, how do we handle responsibility when we're not really proud of what we've done?
Mhm.
How do we, come back from that? How do we think about ourselves in a new way? And so that's one reason why I think animal points of view are such an amazing thing to include in the book, because it really does give you the opportunity to sort of give kids another way of thinking about these sort of big questions that I put my human characters through as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Now, you mentioned that you were doing a school visit. So anything that you'd like to mention there as far as engaging with readers, sort of what you hope they take away with them, and maybe some of the ways you built interaction with young readers.
Well, I think, one of the coolest things about writing for young readers is the fact that you get to meet young readers and talk to them about books, because there's nothing better than a classroom full of kids who are getting really excited about your books, about any books, because, those are the books that really, I remember the books that I read when I was in elementary and middle school. I remember how much they meant to me. Um, and so it's really cool to be able to write for that audience and to say, like, oh, wow, like this is a kid who's responding to my book in that way. I'm
Uh,
talking to a room full of kids and trying to get them excited about books the way I was excited about books. And, I think in terms of what I want them to take away from Wayward Creatures, I wrote this book because, so in this book, Gabe makes a really, he shoplifts some fireworks from a store. As I said, he's feeling alienated, and like his friends are moving away from him. And so he wants to make sort of a grand gesture to sort of make himself look cool and like he's in control of the situation.
mhm,
So
mhm.
he shoplifts these fireworks, and then he sets them off in this forest in his town, and by accident ends up causing a forest fire that burns down this community, landmark. I mean, it's a little park, but it means a lot to the community. And he ends up going through a restorative justice program. And restorative justice is kind of an alternative to the criminal justice system. I'm also a staff attorney in the Vermont Criminal and Family Courts here
Oh,
up in
wow.
Chittenden County.
Hmm. Hmm.
And, so I heard about restorative justice as kind of like something that is adjacent to what I do. I'm in very solidly in the sort of traditional criminal justice, law and order kind of system. And when I heard about restorative justice, I was like, oh, what is this? And I really had to do all this research to kind of change my entire mindset, because it's nowhere near the criminal justice system. It's
Yeah.
it's not about punishment. The person who commits the harm really comes, like, the first step they do is they come in and say, this is what I did. There's no
Mm.
proving who did it. It's not a who done it. It's a, here, I did it. And then they listen to the victims and hear, well, this is how what you did impacted me
Yeah.
and changed my life. And then they work together to come up with a plan to try and repair that harm. And so when I learned about this process, I was like, this is amazing. And I think this is such a transformative way of thinking about when we do something wrong. And especially, I think for young people, if it like, Gabe, when this happens to him, he feels like he's done. He feels like that's it. Here's a
Mhm.
12-year-old kid and he's like, his life's over. Everyone's going to hate me forever. The whole town's going to know that I did this. There's like this burned mark in the middle of the town that everyone's
Yeah.
going to look to and be like, oh, this is what I did. I'll never outlive this. And so it's really a journey, I feel like, for the readers to go along with Gabe to sort of come to a different place with that.
Hmm.
It's not about avoiding responsibility. It's not about, well, I didn't do that. It's saying, okay, well, how do we change our perspective? How do we turn this into something that's a positive? How can we find a way to move forward from this that is actually going to help all of us grow and change our relationship to one another? And so I think
Yeah.
that's an important message that I would love a reader to come away from, is saying, like, okay, something terrible. I've done something that I'm not really proud of. Like, and we've all done it.
Hmm.
And every
Hmm.
kid has done it. Every time I go to a classroom, I say, who's ever, seen their little sister breaks their Lego set, so they, just go and break their sister's favorite toy. Who's ever done anything that you're really not proud of? And every time all the hands go up.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah.
And so it's really, I hope that kids read this book and say, okay, well, maybe the first response to that isn't like, I didn't do it. Like, well, she did it first.
Right.
But there could be a way we actually try to talk to one another and say, okay, well, listen, what you did to me this really hurt me. And so in response, I did that to you. Like, I'm really sorry about that. How can we work together to come to a better place? And so that's what I hope that readers would come away with this, that, if I think it's a great book that can be used if, like, this, I know in a lot of schools, they're doing a lot more restorative circles, and trying to bring some of these concepts into the classroom. Because I think the other piece about a classroom is you have a whole school year, with the same group of kids. And if something bad happens at the beginning of the year, that kid is not necessarily not going to be in the classroom again. And so how do you make the class feel safe and like we're still a community if something bad happens within the community?
Hmm.
I think that restorative justice is one of those tools that can help repair that harm. And this would be a great way to a great book to bring to a community to sort of help start those kinds of conversations in a classroom.
Yeah, I love that. Love that focus on redemption, restoration, and I mean, yeah, sometimes when you're a kid, you think, "Oh, this is the thing. This is the thing that's always going to define me, and this is it." And great to send that message that there is a way forward.
Yeah, I think that I think it's an important thing for kids to realize that there is that it's not just a black and white thing, that it's
Hmm.
not, that, well, this happened and now we're going to punish you and that's it. That
Yeah,
there is this other way of thinking about our relationship to harm and our relationship to the people we've harmed, as opposed to just pushing away, finding a
yeah,
connection, finding a way to make it right or make it better.
yeah, yeah. Well, amazing work there. And I was going to ask about what it's like to write for young people. I'm curious about giving some love to the YA series as well. What it's like to sort of uh, go from place to place in your writing that way, to sort of think about different age groups and kind of craft in that particular way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that story that as I approach a story, for me, stories begin as sort of like one idea and then like another idea, like almost like planets sort of rotating next to one another, or like a coral reef, accreting over time. The ideas come together and then sort of form a novel, and they are sort of pointed into, a direction of like, oh, this is a YA story, or oh, this is a middle grade story. And so for me, No Safety in Numbers really, like, because of the things I ended up talking about in that book, which really ended up being about sort of some of the same ideas, like what does it mean to be in a community, like what do we owe one another in an
Hmm.
extreme circumstance, and what is loyalty, and who do we stay loyal to and why, and sort of those relationships are all at play in the book. One of the original titles that they sort of joked about at the publishing house. It was sort of Lord and Taylor of the Flies, because one of those sort of like very loose under, pinnings, inspiring texts that led to writing that book was Lord of the Flies.
Yeah,
But just
yeah.
the idea of like, what if it was adults and kids? It's boys and girls, all inside the mall. Um, and how would that sort of change the dynamics and some of the things that happen in the story? But it became a very violent story. It became a really intense story,
Mhm.
and it was very much a YA story
Yeah,
on those
yeah.
levels. And ultimately became a story about, well, okay, what if we've lived through something traumatic? Can we like, what does it mean to go back to that? Now, interestingly, Dogs of the Drowned City has almost that same sort of conversation in a totally different context from the point of view of dogs.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
Um, but I think writing that from the point of view of dogs, and sort of being able to play with some of those concepts, and to sort of change the relationship to the violence, since Dogs Down City is about a bunch of dogs also trying to survive kind of a dystopian world. It's about a hurricane wiping out Miami and some dogs who, when they're this actually was based on the dogs from Hurricane Katrina. They were called Katrina dogs, and in Hurricane Katrina, the policy was, hurricane evacuation centers did not allow you to bring pets. Most of them did not.
Yeah.
And because of Hurricane Katrina and the fact that so many people either didn't want to leave their homes because they didn't want to leave their pets behind, or were forced to leave their pets behind, and these pets were sort of left in circumstances where they weren't able to be rescued, or they, sort of, it was truly tragic.
Mhm.
They've changed policies around that. So, for example, in Florida now, there are evacuation centers where you specifically can bring your pets.
Mhm.
But I remember it was sort of inspired by my parents at the time. They lived in Florida. They lived in an apartment building, and there was a little sign in their elevator that said like hurricane evacuation center. It listed where their hurricane evacuation center was, and then it said no dogs allowed.
Mhm. Mhm.
And my parents had a dog, and I was
Yeah,
just sort of like, well, what happens?
yeah.
What would happen to my parents' dog Zeus? So Zeus ended up in the book as a character.
Nice, nice. Yeah. Uh, well,
That transition from a dog story and then like a human story in a mall, like even though they're sort of similar themes, that is one aspect where it was like, okay, this is one way to talk about those same themes for a middle grade, a sort of younger audience. This is another, like, by moving it back into a fully human story, by putting it in this mall, it's more of a YA. We're talking about these topics in a different way. That's really directed more in that sort of YA direction.
well, wonderful. And readers can sort of grow with you in that way. So if they catch on to Wayward Creatures, they can then grow up and read the next books in the series and continue reading on. So I love that as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really fun. I mean, both audiences are really fun to write for. I think that, writing for a teen audience, there are certain things you can definitely cover as a writer that you are
Hmm.
not really going to cover in middle grade. So there is more sort of romance aspects. There are swear words in my YA series. So it's a different vibe. I was trying to talk to, kids in a different way. So it's definitely an older sort of text in that sense. And also, like, there's a lot of adult perspective, and it is dealing with kind of a scary issue. The book was written, well, it was published in 2012, and it's about a biological weapon going off in this mall and all of these people being quarantined inside the mall. So there's like a huge biohazard symbol on the cover of the books. Um, and this all sort of predated, then it's very odd to have written this book and then to have gone through sort of what we went through 4 years ago, sort of
Hmm. Hmm.
quarantining and masking, and to have written that sort of at a different time in a different headspace was pretty trippy.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I usually ask about the works that are coming next. I know we have Wayward Creatures. Anything that's currently in the stages of development that you want to tease for listeners out there, as well as spaces where people can find out more about the work, check out the books, and check out the things that you are all about.
Sure. Well, I have Instagram account, and I always try to sort of update that with where I am in terms of things. I also have a Facebook account, where I sort of also post updates. And then there's always my website, which is just myname.com, all one word. And that's a good place to go if you want to learn about sort of what books I've published. If you want to read, again, my life and dogs, you can see all the dogs I've had in my life, and you can see pictures of, well, on Instagram and my website of my two current cats who are my two loves. And actually, right now, I'm working on a manuscript from my cat's point of view that is sort
Love
of
it.
exploring more of this idea of I'm obsessed with sort of human relationships and just sort of what does it mean to be able to connect with other people, and I'm viewing that all now through my cat's lens. So my cats were rescue cats, and sort of looking at that idea of sort of how do we make connections with people, how can we trust that those connections are going to support us, and so that's what I'm working on right now.
Oh, awesome. Well, there is certainly more than enough in sorting out human relationships for volumes and volumes. So looking forward to more to
It's
come. I'm glad that there's a range of work out there as well. And as I mentioned at the start of the episode, I will be delivering this book to a classroom very, very soon that is close to me. So
well, that's wonderful, thank you so much.
absolutely. Thank you for the time. Thanks for the creativity.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you, it was really wonderful.
Anytime, anytime.